Hey, how's it going? This is Kevin Bass from thedietwars.com, and I'm going to talk to you today about an important issue, or at least important in the context of diet and nutrition online and attitudes that are becoming increasingly prevalent even offline. One of these very important ideas that I'm going to be addressing today, the core idea, in fact, is that the dietary guidelines cause the obesity epidemic. And as we shall see, there's no basis for this idea. In fact, Americans don't even follow the dietary guidelines. Most people don't know what the dietary guidelines are. I don't know what the dietary guidelines are, and I'm an expert in nutrition. I bet the vast majority of experts in nutrition don't know a lot about what the dietary guidelines actually say, and much less does the average person know, and much less does the average person even get close to following them at all. Let's now discuss. As I've said, there's an overwhelming narrative circulating for the past decade or longer, especially generated by the writer Gary Taubes and popularized by him. He's a masterful storyteller. And he says, as we can see in this quote from his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, his magnum opus, he says it's quite possible that the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets we've been told to eat for the past 30 years are not only making us heavier, but contributing to other chronic diseases as well. So not only are these diets that are supposed to be healthy unhealthy, they're also making us fat. So they're making us fat and sick. This is, again, from his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And the story he has told, it's spread throughout the nutrition world, especially online, like wildfire. It is repeated by the likes of Tim Noakes, Nina Teicholz, Jason Fung, and the rest of the who's who of low-carbohydrate dieting gurus. Nina, in particular, has taken Gary's claims to a special extreme, and she gives many talks around the world about how the dietary guidelines cause the obesity epidemic. Her book, which was centered around this idea, in fact, was highly praised by both the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. And I think she won like Best Nonfiction Book of the Year by The Economist and perhaps even the Wall Street Journal as well, where she also has several op-eds. She's repeatedly invited to do op-eds. So the problem is that the problem is that the story that Gary and Nina tell is not true. And we're going to discuss that in this video. Let's dissect the main points of the story. Let's look at it piece by piece. For one, Americans never really consumed a low-fat diet, and they never followed the dietary guidelines to try to consume one. Here are the food availability data from both the Food and Agricultural Association and the United States Department of Agriculture. This one's from the FAO. This one specifically is from the FAO. And as we can see, we get a slight increase in the calories from carbohydrate in the food system. So this is a trend of the per capita, so per person, availability of food per day in the food system. So econometricians measure these things to determine how much food is available each day to each person on average through the food system. And this also includes waste. So there's many of these calories are wasted, and that can bias some of the data. But the good part about this data is that they're objective. It's not based on self-report. It's based on objective facts, sales data, stuff like that, inventory, stocks, like stuff that, econometricians specialize in. Okay, but it's objective. It's not based on self-report. So even though waste is a potential bias, just like misreporting is a potential bias for self-report, waste is a potential bias for food availability. Nonetheless, these food availability data, even whenever waste is an important factor in determining the relative changes, these food availability data give us some insight about how the food environment is changing. And so in this particular case, as we can see, the intake of carbohydrates, or the availability of carbohydrates, only goes up about 250 calories over the course of 1961 to 2015. On the other hand, the calorie availability of fats goes up by about 500 calories, substantially more, maybe 450, substantially more. So again, this food availability data is showing a very clear picture of that, namely, calories from fat is going up to a much greater extent than calories from carbohydrates. it suggests that if we're following the low-fat guidelines, we're doing an awful job of it because we're doing the opposite. Okay. Okay, so and here's the same data from the USDA, the same style of data. Here it starts in the 1970s as opposed to 1960s, but it's the same idea. So again, you have a slight increase in carbohydrate intake, maybe about 300 calories increase in carbohydrate intake. And then you have a about 400 calorie increase in fat intake, or fat availability as it were. So it's not like the fat availability is going down or it's staying the same or like just slightly going up. No, fat availability is outstripping carbohydrate availability in the food system. Okay, so it's like the opposite. It's like not only are we not following the low-fat guidelines, we're eating way more fat than ever. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that per se, but it's just it conflicts with the narrative, and that's what I'm pointing out. So we don't even follow this guideline. Okay, we don't follow the low-fat guidelines. And here I'm going to go show you guys a figure with the average American. They increased their food intake by 452 calories per day between 1970 and 2010, according to the USDA database. Here, importantly, you're going to get about a 50% greater increase in calories from fat than from grains. So added fats account for about a 50% greater increase. So it's 49% versus 37%. Okay, or maybe that may be a 30% greater, but it's still substantial. So the bulk of the increase is driven by fat, not by carbohydrate. The bulk of the increase in calories in the food system is being driven by fat. And what's fat specifically? Soybean oil. Okay, because it's cheap. You can add it to ultra-processed foods. You can cook with it. People are going to restaurants at a much higher rate than ever, and it continues to trend upward. People eat out much more, and people eat more ultra-processed foods. So soybean oil is a great, cheap source of fat to add to ultra-processed foods to make them taste better and to cook food in restaurants or fry food in restaurants. It's a great ingredient with which to do that. And so, therefore, they use soybean oil. Okay? And that's what's driven this increase. Now, let's look at percentage of fat in the diet with cutoffs prescribed by the USDA. And in this case, this is the same thing, food availability data. This is the percentage of fat in the diet. And we can see from 1980, when the dietary guidelines were released, to 1997, where the lowest fat intake was ever achieved. This is only a 4% reduction in fat. A 4% reduction in fat as a percentage of total calories. So from 41% to 37%. Now here's the upper limit fat percentage of the dietary guidelines for Americans from 1980, 30%. So we got like a quarter of the way there from 41%. Got a little bit there, and then we went right back up. Interestingly, now we have a higher percentage intake of fat than at any other time, including before the dietary guidelines were released in 1980. Okay? And then if you look at a real low-fat diet, like if we look at like Bernard's recommendations, Campbell's, Esselstyn's, Graham, Clapper, McDougall, or Ornish's recommendations, it's just about 10% fat. That's a real low-fat diet. Is 30%, below 30% fat really low fat? Seems pretty moderate to me. Below 10% is truly low fat, and guess what? We're eating about 4 times as much fat by calorie. Okay? So we're not eating a low-fat diet in this country, and we never were. But it gets worse. So let's look at where it gets worse. Because if we look at the total fat, not just as a percentage of calories, we find actually even a strikingly different story. So again, here's as a percentage of total calories. And this is from NHANES. Okay, so this is self-report. Again, we see the similar situation, a slight dip in fat intake and an increase in carbohydrate intake as a percentage of total calories, okay? It's as a percentage of total calories. And this just goes to show that we see the same dip in NHANES in the self-reported diet data as we do in the food availability data that we just saw, okay? But here's where, again, here's where it gets interesting. This is percentage of total calories. What happens when we look at absolute calories? Like the actual absolute calories of fat, from fat. Well, we can see absolute calories from fat didn't change at all. Americans didn't reduce fat, we increased carbohydrates. But did we really? Did we really? Check this out. As in a recent paper, as Edward Archer notes, the apparent increase in carbohydrate intake may be just purely methodological. It's an artifact of improved measurement protocols. We can see this here, an artifact of improved measurement protocols, and it's not indicative of a true increase in caloric consumption. Despite this fact, this apparent increase has been regularly published and critically accepted as a true upward trend in caloric consumption and the cause of the obesity epidemic. So first of all, we didn't decrease fat in order to get this increase in carbohydrates. We just increased carbohydrates, and fat content stayed the same. Second, this increase in carbohydrate intake is probably an artifact. It's probably not real. It's probably just the result of the way that scientists measure things. Because look at this. From 1980 to 1994, we see this just massive increase in in grams from carbohydrates. This is massive increase, and we just see it at no other time. All right? It strongly suggests that this is a methodological problem. It's a huge spike, and it's just due to a methodological change, as Edward Archer notes. Okay, and I'm going to include all the references, all the links in the description of the video, or on the Instagram post, or on the podcast description, wherever it's going to end up getting posted. Now, if you look at people who are modeling these effects, and here's among white men by birth cohorts, U.S. born white men by birth cohorts, we see an even more interesting situation because, in fact, the rate of obesity has been steadily increasing over time. It's not just that we're now getting a sudden explosion in obesity, although we are getting a sudden explosion in obesity to an extent previously unrecognized, but the rate of obesity has been gradually increasing ever since the Civil War. Now, USDA does have a food availability set that goes almost as far back as what I just showed, with the rate of obesity going back to the Civil War. And uses a different methodology to document years prior to 1970. And interestingly, the parallels between the increase in obesity and this data set are striking. So we can see very clearly that, again, fat is going up enormously. It's going up from about 1,000 calories per day almost to 2,000 at some points. 1,700, 1,800 calories per day from 1,000, right? We're talking an 80% increase. Whereas carbohydrate intake actually has declined from 1909 to 1959. It's declined by 500 calories, and then it's restored back to its old level by the 2010s, right? By the 2000s, 2010s. So carbohydrate intake ends up not actually staying the same from 1909 to 2009, with fat intake going up and accounting for virtually all of the increase in calories from 1909 to 2009. So if you go over a long enough time period, you see that it's actually entirely fat that's driving the obesity pandemic as far as calories are concerned in the food availability data. And what's more, the above graph is roughly equivalent, consistent with the other food availability data. So check this out. We see here that in 1961, there was an inflection period for total calories in the USDA database. Suddenly, it was like kind of slightly decreasing, and then suddenly, boom, a massive increase. And this occurred in 1961 through 1975, 5 to 20 years before the dietary guidelines were released. This inflection point. But nobody talks about that. So how could the dietary guidelines have caused the obesity pandemic when the obesity pandemic, at least as far as the food availability data are concerned, started 20 years before that? It's not possible. Okay, but let's keep going. This is interesting. So, it's likely that many factors account for the recent explosion in obesity, but whatever they are, the above evidence suggests that the seed oils, soybean oil, the seeds were planted in the 1950s or 60s, and even in the 1870s or 1880s, and not in the 1990s, not as a result of the dietary guidelines. What exactly are Americans eating today? How close are they to the dietary guidelines for Americans? For example, what percentage of Americans fail to consume the foods recommended by the dietary guidelines? And check this out. This is what we know from a 2010 study. And again, I'll link this in the show notes. 80% failed to get the recommended fruits. 75% failed to get recommended whole fruits. 89% total vegetables, 86% green leafy vegetables, 98% orange vegetables, 96% legumes, 61% starchy vegetables, 58% other vegetables, 85% milk, 99% whole grains, 48% meat and beans, and 80% oils. And now, interestingly, meat and beans has the lowest rate of non-adherence to the dietary guidelines. I wonder why. It's because people like to eat meat. They want to eat meat. It's part of the reason why low carb is popular. It's because it tells people to do things that they want to do. So people generally want to eat meat. So the rate at which the meat intake does not quite reach the dietary guidelines preferred. The rate at which the meat intake doesn't meet the dietary guidelines recommendation is lowest of any of the food groups, right? Kind of reflecting that people really like meat, okay? And so what is the percentage of Americans consuming more than their maximum discretionary energy allowance from solid fats and added sugars? From solid fats, 95% of Americans consume in excess. And added sugars, 77%, almost 80% consume in excess, almost 4 in 5. How far are Americans from meeting the recommendations laid out in the actual dietary guidelines on average? So data are available for this as well. And so this is where we're going to get into this graph we're talking about here. As we can see, they're eating about half as many total vegetables. So the orange is about what they're actually eating in different age groups. So if we're talking about 19 to 30-year-olds, we're looking at this here, right? This is what they're eating. This is what's recommended up here in the blue. And so they're eating about half as much as what's recommended. And older people do a little bit better, okay? Mainly because what's recommended drops, but yeah. And it's a similar situation for females and for males. It's a similar situation, okay? So now we're gonna look at the fruits. Fruits, similar situation. 2 to 2.5 servings per day are recommended, whereas, the average 19 to 30-year-old gets less than 1. Total grains. Actually, we do meet total grains. That's one thing. We tend to meet total grains. However, it's going to get more complicated than that because although we meet total grain recommendations, we don't meet the whole grain recommendations. Okay? Dairy, we're far under the recommended dairy intake. Protein foods, we're doing pretty well because we like meat. Remember, we do like meat. And yeah. Now, let's look at dark green vegetables, okay? Dark green vegetables, we're doing terrible there. Like a third as much is what we need, or less. And red and orange vegetables, also awful. Legumes, we're eating about half as much, or a quarter, or a third as much. Starchy vegetables, about half, maybe 60% as much as what's recommended. Other vegetables, same thing, right? So it's very, very consistent. Americans don't meet the dietary guidelines recommendations on virtually anything except for meat, on average. Okay, all right. So they're and importantly, we are over-consuming refined grains almost twofold, and consuming only 25% of recommended unrefined grains. And we see this here. Look, you see the green. The green is the average whole grains intake, and that's like a quarter of what is recommended. And then the orange is the refined grains. The refined grains intake, okay? And it's far exceeding what's actually recommended by the guidelines. In fact, the guidelines recommend a minimum of 50% of all grains come from whole grains. In this case, it's like 1/7 of the grains come from whole grains and the rest come from processed grains. It totally violates the guidelines. So you say that, people are eating enough grains, people are following the guidelines in that respect. No, they're not. They're eating enough total grains, but they're violating the guidelines recommendations on whole grains. Most Americans don't eat very many whole grains. In fact, the average American eats less than one serving, less than 1 ounce equivalent of whole grains per day. It's bananas. Or it's nuts. I could call it grains, but yeah, bananas or nuts is the only foods we got. All right. Dad joke. Okay, so we're going to go look at meat. poultry and eggs, seafood, and nuts, seeds, and soy products. And we can see very clearly here meat, poultry, and eggs. Right? Meat, poultry, and eggs. We can see that men are over-consuming meat according to the dietary guidelines. And I think this is probably, we need some caveats here because I think the dietary guidelines under-recommend protein intake. I think they're not consistent with the evidence. And we definitely under-consume seafood. And we hit nuts and seeds and soy products, you know, pretty good, but not perfect. Okay? In some cases, we eat about half as much, depending on the age. Let's look at oils and solid fats. So for average oils intake, we again fall short of the recommendations. On average solid fats intake, we exceed them. So butter versus say olive oil. Okay, we don't eat very much olive oil. We eat a lot of butter, and that's going to be unhealthy as hell. And incidentally, recently, if you guys have been watching the Huberman Twitter account, he now says he eats minimal butter. So thank you, my friends. You may have played a role in that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to the butter episode earlier on my channel. Now, let's look at added sugars. They're overconsumed by between 20 or 80%, depending on the age group. Now, this is pretty bananas here. Look at that. Almost double, almost double the recommended maximum of 10% of calories. And that's like the maximum. And that's unrealistic as a maximum because this maximum also includes saturated fat. So if you eat any saturated fat whatsoever, then suddenly your maximum added sugars is going to plummet as well. So this even underrepresents the magnitude of the problem. Right? We're eating like double the amount of sugar. That is the maximum allowed. And there's also what's called an ideal dietary pattern, and that's even below this maximum. It's like way below. It's like two teaspoons of sugar is allowed. What about saturated fats? As we know, with saturated fats, people are over-consuming those as well. Okay? Way above the maximum intake. Way above. Okay? Sodium is the same issue. Massive overconsumption, and it's double the recommended intake in many age groups. But these are all from survey data. You know, all this stuff about adherence, all these orange dots and blue squares, this is all survey data. But what do the food balance data say? So back to the food availability data, they're not great. So they consume less than half of the recommended fruit and less than 7% of the recommended vegetables and half of the recommended dairy. You see that in these figures here. So 2014, we're doing a little bit better on vegetables, we're doing a little bit better on fruit. And dairy's not, that's just like stagnated, right? As far as like meeting the guidelines. So we're just not meeting the guidelines. The vast majority of us are not meeting the guidelines, especially when you start getting into the details. Like almost, we're all violating the guidelines, and the average American like violates like all of them. So Americans overconsume total grains, with most of the recent increase being from corn. And they're overconsuming refined grains. And they also overconsume protein relative to the recommendations, but the recommendations are probably wrong, so we can probably step back a little bit there. Now, let's look at the grains consumption. So from 1970 to 2014, we're now getting enough grains, right? But we're not getting unrefined grains. And that's driven by increasing corn products, which is not good. So we may say, oh, we're meeting the recommendations, but like it's probably worse because the way that we're meeting the recommendations is through like refined corn. It's not a good thing. Okay, and then we've got protein foods, right? We've got protein foods over here. Fish, shellfish, eggs, tree nuts, peanuts, poultry, and red meat. And we're over-consuming a little bit, right? We're over-consuming a little bit. But we're doing a bit better there. And probably, to be honest, like, it's questionable, that part of the dietary guidelines, in my opinion. Let's go on to the added sugar. Now, if we look at the added sugar, it's a massive difference between the guidelines and the between the guidelines and the recommendation and what the average actual behavioral pattern is. Okay, so based on a 2,000 calorie diet in 1970, we were consuming 60% more than the dietary guidelines allowed, and by 2014, it became about 80% more. Okay, so we're always consuming more sugar than the dietary guidelines allow. The dietary guidelines are not telling us not to eat sugar, by the way. They're telling us don't eat sugar. Just because they're low-fat guidelines doesn't mean they want you to eat sugar. That's not how the dietary guidelines work. Okay. So what foods do Americans eat? According to a recent study, nearly 2/3 are ultra-processed. Nearly 2/3. And what are the major sources of calories in the American diet? Well, a 2012 study clearly and cleanly summed this up in a single table. As we can see here, the top categories of food in terms of the calorie intake, according to the self-report, is yeast, bread, and rolls. That's number one, okay? And that's 27.2% of total calories. And then second is cakes, cookies, quick bread, pastries, and pies, also 7.2%. Third is soda drinks, soft drinks, etc., 5.4%. Four is beef, then it's alcoholic beverage and cheese, poultry, then you get down to candy, then crackers, popcorn, pretzels, chips, biscuits. We go all the way down and find very clearly that the American diet is ultra-processed. The issue with it is not that it's like full of carbs. The issue is that like all the carbs it's full of is like bad. Okay, so it's worth noting that critics often point to the large quantity of grains in the American diet as indicating that Americans are somehow following dietary guidelines. Yet it's worth looking at the kinds of carbohydrates and grains that Americans actually eat. Let's look at this. So as we can see, number one is soft drinks and soda. Number two is yeast rolls. Number three is cakes, cookies, quick bread, and then candy, sugars, sugary foods, fruit. Fruit is number five. That's great. At least you got fruit in there. So we got number six is going to be biscuits, cornbread, etc., pancakes, tortillas, blah, 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 blah. Basically, most of the sources of carbs that Americans eat are bad. They're not healthy. So yeah, of course, if you cut out carbs from an American diet, you're going to do better because the foods are not healthy that we're eating that are full of carbs, the carb-rich foods, okay? All right. So there's scarcely a whole grain to be found here, and that's consistent with the above 2010 paper showing that only 1% of the American population, yes, only 1%, consumed the recommended whole grains. And then it's worth looking at the guidelines themselves, okay? So check this out. Here's what the guidelines explicitly says. At least half of the amount of whole grains that is recommended should be from at least half the amount of grains recommended should be from whole grains. At least half. Are Americans meeting this recommendation? No, like not remotely, right? So Americans are not consuming anything remotely close to what the dietary guidelines for Americans recommends. Suggesting otherwise is dishonest, and so a lot of people do, like Nina Teicholz, Jason Fung, Tim Noakes, Zoe Hartcomb, many, many, many more. They all say that Americans are consuming the dietary guidelines, and that's not true. The purpose of making such a claim is sensationalist. It turns, the diet wars into a battle of David versus Goliath. These people who are excluded and marginalized, telling the real truth about the science, up against the swarmy health and nutrition scientists who are telling people to lie and telling people to eat grains and then causing them to be sick. Well, guess what? People don't follow the dietary guidelines in the first place. So, like, even if the dietary guidelines could cause obesity, the fact that Americans are not following them just means that they're not. They can't be causing the obesity epidemic, even if they could. Yeah, so that's the truth about the dietary guidelines and the adherence of Americans thereto. We don't adhere to them. Our adherence to the dietary guidelines hasn't changed all that much over the years, although there's a slightly increasing proportion of people who do adhere to the dietary guidelines. over time, more and more. But over the years, dietary guidelines haven't changed American eating behavior by all that much. In fact, the overwhelming source of influence on Americans' eating behavior is from corporations, not from dietary guidelines, right? Corporate media, marketing, corporate advertising, that's going to be what's driving a lot of the change. Also, availability of these foods is part of American food culture, and there's so many other different issues. That's what's driving the changes in the American diet, and often in negative directions, have nothing to do with the guidelines. Okay, so I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, check me out at TikTok, Instagram, Twitter at Kevin Nbass, KVINNBASS. Also check me out on Patreon. Donate. If you could donate to me, that would help me out, enable me to make more videos, enable me to be more productive, enable me to hire somebody to help me be more productive, and have a big team, and then crush the internet with good information. That's the goal in the long term for me. Crush the whole world with good information. That's what my plan is. That's what my life plan is. I need money to do that. So if you guys can help me out at the beginning, this is at the time before I became big, when I was still underground. You knew me before I was famous. This is the time you can help me so that I can then pursue that goal. So the more you free me there, the more I can then ladder up to other ways of making money, and then really start spreading the good stuff on the world. Check out the account on YouTube, also on the major podcast platforms of The Kevin Bass Show. Make sure to rate or review if you haven't already, and you're one of my listeners. Now, if you're one of my listeners and you haven't rated or reviewed, click that pause button immediately and do it. And please subscribe for the same reasons. Subscribe, and then notify whenever a new video comes out. Click on that option as well, at least on YouTube. Make a comment if you have any constructive or comments that are less, that are more critical. Please leave those. And of course, don't, try to take my head off with an ad hominem, but I very much appreciate negative feedback that can help me to grow and improve the way I'm podcasting. So I appreciate you guys, and I hope you appreciated this. Have a good one. See you guys in the next video.